My name is Felicia, and for a long time I lived in a shadow I didn't even know was there. I spent a decade of my life building a home, a career, and a future for someone else, only to be told on my 39th birthday that I was no longer the upgrade they wanted. Before I share the story of how I turned that betrayal into my greatest victory, I want to take a moment to say a heartfelt thank you to each and every one of you. I am deeply humbled that you have chosen to spend your precious time here with me. It is a true honor to share these stories of the heart with a community as beautiful as this one. We all face moments that threaten to break us, but I am here to tell you that you are the architect of your own light. No one can dim your soul unless you let them. If this story touches your spirit or reminds you of your own incredible worth, I would be so grateful if you joined our family by subscribing to Queen's Revenge. And to my dear subscribers who have walked this path with me, may your lives be blessed with an abundance of wealth, and may your hearts forever overflow with a happiness that no one can ever take away. Let's begin. The amber glow of the candlelight danced across the rim of my crystal flute, turning the vintage Krug into liquid gold. Around me, the ambient hum of Lardist, one of the city's most coveted dining rooms, felt like a warm velvet embrace. My friends were a blur of expensive silk and genuine laughter, their voices rising in a melodic crescendo as they began the ritualistic song of another year lived. I was 39 today. A milestone. A precipice. I felt elegant, grounded, and for the first time in a decade, utterly secure. Make a wish, Felicia. Chloe chirped, her eyes sparkling with the reflected fire of the 3 large candles centered on a decadent Valrhona chocolate torte. I looked at the flames, their heat radiating against my cheeks. My wish was simple. I wanted this stability, this love, this sense of being arrived. I thought of Julian. He was supposed to be here, but a last-minute closing at the firm had delayed him. He had promised to meet us for dessert. I closed my eyes, the scent of rich cocoa and expensive perfume filling my lungs, and I blew. As the smoke curled into the air, my phone vibrated against the white linen tablecloth. It was a sharp, discordant rhythm that pierced through the laughter. My heart did a tiny, expectant flutter. Julian. He was likely downstairs, complaining to the valet about the parking, or perhaps he was sending a floral arrangement that was too large for the table. That was his brand of romance. Grand, loud, and designed to be noticed. I picked up the device. The screen was a blinding white rectangle in the dim light. Julian. Hey Felicia. I wanted to be upfront with you. I found someone better. Someone younger, hotter, and honestly, an upgrade. I've already transferred our shared funds into my personal account. It felt fair since I was the one bringing in the heavy hitters anyway. No hard feelings. Enjoy your birthday. The world didn't stop. It shattered. The sound of the restaurant, the clinking of silver, the low murmur of jazz, Chloe's giggling, suddenly felt like it was happening underwater. I could feel the blood draining from my extremities, leaving my fingers numb and my toes like ice. It was a visceral, physical theft of warmth. The chocolate torte, which moments ago looked like a masterpiece, now smelled like something rotting. The sweetness was cloying, nauseating. It felt like a thick, dark oil coating the back of my throat. I read the words again. Upgrade. Fair. Younger. The words burned into my retinas like neon acid. 39. He had waited until I hit the final year of my 30s to execute me. It wasn't just a breakup. It was a demolition. He had timed it with surgical precision to ensure the maximum amount of psychological wreckage. He didn't just want to leave. He wanted to invalidate every year I had given him. Felicia? You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost, Mark said, his hand hovering near my arm. I looked up. The transition was instantaneous. My mind, usually a place of soft emotions and artistic nuance, suddenly hardened into something obsidian. A strange, terrifying calm washed over me. It was the survival instinct of a woman who had spent years navigating the corporate ladder, now redirected toward the man who thought he could discard her like an outdated model of a smartphone. Julian can't make it, I said. My voice didn't shake. It was a terrifyingly melodic lie. A complication with the contract. He's devastated, but he told us to order the most expensive bottle of cognac on the menu on his tab. My friends cheered. They didn't see the carnage behind my eyes. They didn't see the way my stomach was twisting into knots of pure bile, or how every nerve ending was screaming in a high-pitched frequency. Underneath the table, my thumb hovered over the keyboard. I thought of the thousands of dollars I had poured into his startup ideas. I thought of the nights I spent editing his proposals while he slept. I thought of the joint account, the one he thought he had fairly emptied. Julian had always been a creature of ego. He mistook my silence for submission and my grace for weakness. He assumed that because I was the stabilizer in the relationship, I was also the one without teeth. He had forgotten who actually managed the logistics of our life. He had forgotten whose name was on the deed of the apartment we shared. He had forgotten that while he was out bringing in the heavy hitters, I was the one who built the stadium they played in. I typed back a single word. Felicia. Congrats. No exclamation point. No plea for an explanation. No, how could you? I refused to give him the satisfaction of my tears. He wanted a scene. He wanted to hear me shatter over the phone so he could tell his younger, hotter replacement how unstable and controlling I was. I would give him nothing but a mirror of his own coldness. I set the phone down face up. I watched the bubbles in my champagne rise and die. The betrayal felt like a heavy weight in my chest, a physical mass of lead that made it hard to breathe. I could feel the heat of the restaurant's hearth behind me, but I was shivering. The upgrade comment stung the most. It was a deliberate strike at the vulnerability of my age, a reminder that in the world Julian inhabited, women were merely assets with expiration dates. But Julian had made a fatal error in his calculations. He thought he was leaving me with nothing. He thought that by emptying the joint account, he had stripped me of my power. He didn't realize that I had stopped trusting his financial genius months ago. He didn't know about the private account I'd established the moment he started turning his phone face down at dinner. He didn't know that I had been documenting his business expenses that looked suspiciously like jewelry for someone else. To Felicia. Chloe raised her glass again. To the strongest woman I know. 39 never looked so dangerous. I raised my glass, the sharp edge of my smile reflecting in the crystal. You're right, Chloe, I said, my voice like silk stretched over a blade. Dangerous is exactly the word. As I took a sip of the champagne, it no longer tasted like gold. Tasted like iron. Like blood. The massacre was over. Julian had fired the first shot, and he was currently celebrating his victory in some hidden corner of the city, draped over a 20-something-year-old who probably thought he was a king. He didn't know that the walls of his kingdom were already beginning to smoke. He didn't know that I wasn't the victim of this story. I was the architect of what came next. And I was about to design a ruin so spectacular, he would never find his way out of the debris. The laughter around the table felt like shards of glass pressing against my skin, bright, sharp, and entirely disconnected from the frozen core of my being. Mark was mid-anecdote, his hands gesturing wildly as he described a mishap at the office, and Chloe was doubled over, her pearls clicking rhythmically against the table edge. To them, the world was still spinning on its axis of celebration and vintage wine. To me, the axis had snapped, sending my reality into a silent, airless vacuum. I felt a strange, terrifying glaciation beginning at the base of my spine and creeping upward. It wasn't the trembling chill of fear, but rather the anesthetic numbness of a surgeon preparing for a difficult procedure. I watched my own hand as it rested on the linen tablecloth. It was perfectly still. Not a single tremor betrayed the fact that my life had just been firebombed via a text message. Julian had always admired my composure. He called it my regal air. He didn't realize that this composure was a fortress I had built brick by brick over 39 years. And right now the gates were slamming shut, locking him out forever. I leaned back into the plush velvet of the banquette, the fabric biting into my shoulders. My mind began to peel back the layers of the last year, performing an autopsy on our relationship in real time. This was what I now understood as the zero downtime betrayal. In the corporate world I inhabited, zero downtime meant a seamless transition from one system to another without the user ever noticing a glitch. Julian had applied it to our love. While I was choosing the exact shade of warm oatmeal for the guest's bedroom, he was likely scouting for a bachelor pad. While I was staying up late to help him rehearse his pitch for the venture capitalists, he was rehearsing his exit speech in his head, or perhaps sharing it with Serafina between the sheets I had meticulously picked out for their thread count. He hadn't just left. He had performed a hot swap. He had waited until the very moment he felt secure in his new life to discard the old one, ensuring that he never had to spend a single night alone, or a single day feeling the weight of his own guilt. The sheer efficiency of it was what turned my blood to slush. It was calculated. It was predatory. "Felicia, darling, you're miles away," Chloe said, reaching across to pat my hand. Her touch felt intrusive, like a warm hand on a block of dry ice. "Is the cognac hitting you already?" "I'm just savoring the moment, Chloe," I replied. My voice sounded foreign to my own ears, low, resonant, and entirely devoid of the warmth that usually characterized my speech. "I'm realizing that tonight is a very important turning point." "To turning points," Mark cheered, raising his glass. I raised mine in return, the liquid sloshing gently against the crystal. "Yes, to turning points. To the moment the prey stops running and realizes the hunter has left his flank exposed." My phone lay on the table, the screen timed out, but the words were etched into my mind like a brand. Upgrade. It was a word meant to dehumanize. It suggested that I was a piece of hardware, functional for a time, but ultimately replaceable by a model with better specs and fewer miles. It was a classic move from the Julian playbook. Project your own shallow insecurities onto the person you're hurting, so they feel too small to fight back. But Julian had made a fatal error. He had mistaken my silence for a lack of weapons. I picked up the phone. My thumb hovered over the screen. I could feel the heat of the restaurant again, the smell of the searing steaks from the open kitchen, the heavy scent of lilies from the foyer, but it couldn't touch the ice inside. I didn't want to call him. I didn't want to hear his voice, which would undoubtedly be filled with that faux sympathy he used when he was being particularly cruel. I didn't want to give him the closure he likely craved, the chance to hear me sob so he could tell himself he was a good guy for being honest with me. I typed one word. 7 letters. A lifetime of restraint distilled into a single sharp edge. "Felicia. Congrats." I hit send. The act of sending that message felt like pulling a pin on a silent grenade. I could almost hear the digital pulse traveling through the air, finding his phone in whatever dark corner of the city he was hiding in. I imagined him staring at it, waiting for the follow-up, waiting for the why, or the who is she, or the how could you do this on my birthday. I would give him none of it. Silence, I realized, was the only thing Julian couldn't manipulate. He could argue with anger. He could dismiss tears. He could charm his way out of an accusation. But silence was a mirror. It would force him to look at his own reflection, and without my light to soften the edges, I knew he wouldn't like what he saw. The heartbreak was there, buried deep beneath the permafrost. I could feel it thrumming, a dull rhythmic ache that whispered of the 10 years I had invested in a ghost. I remembered the way he used to tuck my hair behind my ear, the way he promised we would grow old together on a vineyard in Tuscany. Those memories tried to surface, tried to soften my resolve with the salt of tears. I pushed them down. I didn't have time for the luxury of grief. Not yet. Julian had emptied the joint account. He thought he had crippled me financially, leaving me tethered to the ground while he soared with his upgrade. He thought he was the architect of this ruin. He didn't know that I had been the one holding the blueprints all along. He had been so focused on the heavy hitters and the big moves that he had neglected the fine print. He didn't know that I had seen the first withdrawal 3 months ago. He didn't know that I had spent my lunch hours at a different bank, opening an account in my maiden name. He didn't know that the overtime I was putting in wasn't just for my firm, but for my own survival. A cold, calculated clarity settled over me, sharp as a diamond. I looked at my friends, their faces blurred by the candlelight, and I felt a surge of something that wasn't quite happiness, but was far more potent power. Julian had spent years trying to make me smaller, trying to convince me that I was lucky to have a man of his stature. He had tried to dim my light so he could feel like the sun. And now he had finally handed me the greatest gift a man like him could ever give a woman like me. He had underestimated me. "Is everything okay with the cognac, ma'am?" the waiter asked, appearing at my side like a shadow. "It's perfect," I said, looking him straight in the eye. "Actually, could you bring the bill? And please make sure you put it on the card we have on file. The one ending in 4022. Julian's card. The one he had used to pay for the big dinners to maintain his image, the one I had secondary access to. Let him pay for one last meal. Let him pay for the very moment his world began to burn. Of course, Ms. Walker. I stood up, smoothing the silk of my dress. I felt tall. I felt lethal. The birthday girl was dead. Long live the architect. Where are you going, Fee? Chloe asked, looking up. The party's just starting, Chloe, I said, a sharp crystalline smile playing on my lips. I just realized I have some home improvements to attend to. Immediately. As I walked out of Lardis, the cool night air hit my face, but I didn't shiver. The ice was inside me now, and it was the only thing keeping me upright. Julian thought he was upgrading his life. He was about to find out that when you trade a foundation for a facade, the whole house tends to come crashing down. And I was going to be the one to kick the first pillar. The Uber ride home was a symphony of city lights and muffled tires against wet asphalt. I leaned my head against the cool glass of the window, watching the neon signs of the city blur into streaks of electric blue and poisonous violet. My reflection in the dark window looked like a stranger. A woman with sharp cheekbones and eyes that had seen the end of the world and decided to remodel it. I wasn't crying. Crying was for the blindsided. I was merely reviewing the data. I closed my eyes and let my mind drift back 6 months. The shift had been subtle, like a slow-acting toxin entering a bloodstream. It began with the phone. For 9 years our devices were open books, lying scattered on the bedside table, or the kitchen island like shared secrets. Then, almost overnight, Julian's phone developed a permanent face-down orientation. It became an extension of his hand, a digital iron curtain that dropped the moment I entered a room. I remembered the first time I asked about it. We were having dinner, sushi his favorite, and a notification lit up his screen. He swiped it away with a frantic, jerky motion that made the soy sauce ripple in its dish. "Just work, babe," he had said, his voice a fraction too high. "The new project is a beast. You know how it is." I did know how it was. I knew Julian's work habits better than he did. Julian was a big-picture man, a chaser of shadows who loved the prestige of the deal but loathed the grit of the execution. He was not the type to stay until 11 p.m. for overtime 3 nights a week. Yet suddenly the office was his second home. I would lie in our bed, the space beside me cold and vast, listening for the sound of his key in the lock. When he finally did arrive, he smelled not of coffee and fluorescent lights, but of high-end gin and a faint, floral top note that didn't belong to any of my perfumes. I had played the part of the supportive partner. I had greeted him with a soft smile and a warm plate of food I knew he wouldn't eat. But inside, the architect in me was already spotting the cracks in the foundation. The true structural failure, however, happened 3 months ago. We were sitting in the living room, the space I had decorated with curated art and memories. Julian was swirling a glass of Macallan, looking at the ceiling as if calculating the weight of the world. "Felicia," he started, using that tone he reserved for important discussions, the one that sounded like a TED Talk but felt like an interrogation. "I've been looking at our joint savings. It's a bit disorganized. You're great at the domestic stuff, but I think I should take over the heavy lifting of our investments. It's just easier if the funds are under my name. I'm better with the market, babe. I'll make sure we're set for life." He had accompanied this with a dismissive wave of his hand, as if my contribution to our wealth, a decade of 6-figure salaries and meticulous budgeting, was a charming little hobby. In that moment I felt a sharp crystalline prick of intuition. It wasn't just arrogance. It was a heist. Julian wasn't trying to set us up for life. He was trying to liquidate me. He saw me as a depreciating asset he needed to cash out before moving on to the next venture. I had looked at him, my expression a mask of thoughtful consideration. "You might be right, Julian," I had whispered, my heart hammering a rhythmic warning against my ribs. "You've always had such a keen eye for opportunities." He had beamed at me, convinced of his own brilliance, convinced that he had successfully gaslit the woman who had helped build his career. He thought he had one. He didn't realize that the second he finished that sentence, I had mentally moved him from the partner column to the liability column. I didn't argue. I didn't scream about the unfairness of it. Instead, I went to work. Every architect knows that the best way to preserve a structure is to move the weight before the collapse. Over the next 12 weeks, I performed a masterclass in financial camouflage. I didn't drain the joint account. That would have been a flare in the night, a signal for him to panic. Instead, I initiated the slow bleed. A few $100s here for extravagant grocery runs. A furniture upgrade that never arrived, the refund diverted to a private account in my maiden name. A work bonus that I told him was delayed, but which actually found a home in a vault he didn't even know existed. I was siphoning my life back drop by drop, while he watched the balance of the joint account stay just high enough to keep his ego inflated. I remembered the feeling of sitting in a sterile bank office across town, signing the papers for my secret account. The air in that room had tasted like freedom. I wasn't just saving money, I was building a life raft. As the Uber pulled up to the curb of my apartment building, the lease he had been too lazy to put his name on, I looked at the darkened windows of the penthouse. Julian thought he was the one upgrading. He thought he was the one taking the money and the power, leaving me with the emotional wreckage of a 39-year-old discard. He truly believed that Serafina, with her 22-year-old skin and her vacuous Instagram captions, was a better investment. He had forgotten that a building is only as strong as its foundation, and he had just handed me the sledgehammer. I stepped out of the car, the cool wind whipping my hair across my face. I felt a surge of adrenaline so intense it was almost physical. The betrayal stung, yes. The memory of his "I found someone better" text was a jagged blade in my side. But the pain was secondary to the focus. Julian had spent 6 months building an exit strategy. I had spent 3 months building a trap. He thought he had taken all our money. He didn't realize he had only taken the bait. I had left him exactly enough to feel confident, exactly enough to make him reckless. And a reckless man is a man who makes mistakes. I walked toward the entrance, my heels clicking a sharp, lethal rhythm on the pavement. "No hard feelings, Julian," I whispered to the empty street. "Just business." I reached into my bag and pulled out my keys. In my pocket, my phone buzzed again. Another notification, another digital ghost of the man I used to love. I didn't even look at it. I was no longer interested in his narrative. I was about to write the final chapter of his. The silence of the penthouse was a physical weight, a suffocating shroud of expensive minimalism that suddenly felt like a tomb. I stood in the center of the living room, my coat still draped over my shoulders, my birthday heels discarded near the door like casualties of war. The air smelled of the diptyque candles I had lit this morning, scents of figuier and bays that were supposed to welcome a husband home to a celebration. Now they just smelled like a funeral. My phone buzzed. Not a text this time. A notification. "Chloe tagged you in a post." No, that wasn't right. I swiped the screen. It was a link from Chloe sent via DM, followed by a string of OMGs, and "I am going to kill him" messages. My heart, already a bruised and battered thing, began a frantic, irregular drumbeat. I clicked the link. It was Instagram. Julian's profile. He had waited exactly 62 minutes. The precision of it was almost impressive, a choreographed digital assassination. He hadn't just moved on. He had hard-launched. The photo was a masterpiece of performative cruelty. There was Julian, looking leaner and more tan than he had this morning, his arm draped possessively around a girl who looked like she was made of filtered sunlight and unearned confidence. Serafina. She was 22, perhaps 23. She had the kind of effortless, dewy beauty that only exists before life has had a chance to leave its mark. She was wearing a silk slip dress in a shade of champagne that I had once told Julian was my favorite. They were in a suite at the Nomad, a hotel I had introduced him to. The caption was a jagged shard of glass aimed directly at my throat. "The glow-up is real. Out with the old, in with the new. Hashtag upgraded, hashtag new chapter, hashtag first class only." The breath left my lungs in a ragged gasp. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the word. Old. At 39, I was the old. I was the outdated software, the cluttered hard drive, the worn-out upholstery. I was the bridge he had crossed to get to the destination, and now that he had arrived, he was setting the bridge on fire for the entertainment of his followers. I made the mistake of scrolling down. I knew I shouldn't. Every instinct told me to put the phone in the microwave and watch it melt, but I couldn't stop. I needed to see the full extent of the ruin. The comments were a feeding frenzy of anonymity and shallow adoration. "Okay, King. Big upgrade." One user wrote, accompanied by fire emojis. Damn, my guy upgraded from economy to first class. Rip to the ex, she must be crying in her cereal right now, said another. The glow up is insane. Stay winning, Julian. Economy to first class. That was the phrase that broke the final dam. I looked around my apartment, the art on the walls I had curated, the furniture I had negotiated for, the very lifestyle that Julian had worn like a borrowed coat for a decade. I was economy. I, who had stabilized his erratic finances, who had coached him through every promotion, who had been the architect of the very king status he was currently flaunting. The pain was no longer a dull ache, it was a white-hot incandescent roar. It vibrated in my teeth and hummed in my fingernails. In that moment I realized that Julian's theft wasn't just about the money. The empty joint account was a setback, a logistical hurdle. But this public humiliation, this calculated attempt to label me as expired, while he paraded a child as a trophy? This was an attempt to steal my dignity. He wanted to strip me of my history, to make the 10 years we spent together look like a mistake he had finally fixed. He wanted me to be the crazy ex-girlfriend. He wanted me to call him screaming, to leave desperate voicemails, to spiral into a visible messy breakdown that would only validate his choice. He wanted to look at Serafina and feel refreshed, because the woman who knew his secrets, his failures, and his debts was finally out of the picture. I stood in the dark, the blue light of the phone illuminating my face, and I felt a transformation so profound it was anatomical. The heartbreak didn't vanish, it was still there, a gaping wound in my chest, but it was being cauterized by a cold surgical fury. Julian had spent years underestimating me because I was the stable one. He thought my grace was a lack of fire. He thought my silence was a lack of strategy. He truly believed that because I chose to build rather than destroy, I didn't know how to do the latter. Economy class, I whispered to the empty room. My voice was a ghost, thin and sharp. I looked at the photo again. Serafina's smile was vacuous, her eyes fixed on the camera lens, not on the man holding her. She didn't love Julian. She loved the nomad suite, the champagne, and the version of him that I had spent 10 years polishing. She was holding a man who was, in reality, a hollow shell of debt and arrogance. Julian thought he was in first class. He didn't realize he was on a plane with no engines, and he had just kicked the only pilot out of the cockpit. He wanted a digital dagger? Fine. I would give him an analog execution. He had forgotten that I was the one who managed the passwords to our shared life. He had forgotten that while he was busy hard-launching his new life on Instagram, the paperwork for his old life was still sitting in my office. He had forgotten that the very phone he was using to humiliate me was part of a family plan that I paid for. I felt a strange, terrifying sense of peace. The birthday massacre was over. The sharpness of silence had done its job. Now it was time for the architect to start the demolition. I didn't block him. I didn't report the photo. I didn't even unfollow. I wanted to see it all. I wanted every like and every fire emoji to serve as a reminder of exactly how much he deserved what was coming. Every insult from a stranger was a brick in the wall I was building around his future. I walked to my desk and opened my laptop. The screen flickered to life, reflecting in my eyes. I didn't look like a woman who had been upgraded. I looked like a woman who was about to audit a soul. First class, I murmured, my fingers hovering over the keys. Let's see how you handle the turbulence, Julian. The first domino was already wobbly. I just needed to breathe on it. I reached for my glass of wine, took a slow, deliberate sip, and began the process of erasing Julian Carter from the world he thought he owned. The penthouse was too quiet. It was the kind of silence that had teeth, gnawing at the edges of the memories that inhabited these rooms. I stood in the foyer, the marble floor cold beneath my bare feet. Julian had always called this our sanctuary, but as I looked at the minimalist lines and the curated shadows, I saw only my own labor. My signature was on the wire transfers for the Italian sofa. My eye had selected the charcoal-hued drapery. My credit score had been the key that unlocked this view of the skyline. Julian had been too busy, with his grand visions, to bother with the mundane details of a lease agreement. "Babe, you're the organized one," he'd said with that effortless, lopsided grin that used to make my heart skip. "Just put it in your name. I'll handle the heavy lifting later." Later never came. And now his laziness was my most potent weapon. I reached for my phone and dialed a number I'd found during the Uber ride. The ringing was a sharp, clinical sound in the darkness. Citywide 24-hour locksmith. How can I help you? I need an emergency lock change, I said. My voice was a calm, steady blade. The penthouse on West 57th. I have the lease and my ID ready for verification. 40 minutes later, the hallway echoed with the rhythmic, metallic rasp of a drill. The locksmith, a man named Elias with tired eyes and grease-stained cuticles, didn't ask questions. People in this city only called for a lock change at midnight for one of two reasons: a lost key or a lost love. He could clearly see which one I was dealing with by the way I stood, shoulders back, jaw set, watching him work with the detached interest of an architect observing a demolition. "New cylinder is in, ma'am," Elias grunted, handing me a set of 3 silver keys. They felt heavy. They felt like a verdict. "I've programmed the deadbolt and disabled the old fobs." "Thank you, Elias." I paid him with a tip that made him blink, then closed the door. Click. The sound of the bolt sliding into place was the most satisfying thing I had heard in 10 years. It was the sound of a boundary being restored. It was the sound of Julian Carter becoming a trespasser in his own life. But I wasn't done. The apartment was still contaminated by his presence. I walked into the walk-in closet, a space that was supposed to be a shared dream, now a crime scene of his vanity. I pulled a roll of heavy-duty black trash bags from the laundry room. They were thick, opaque, and utilitarian, the perfect vessels for the first-class life Julian thought he had secured. I didn't fold. I didn't reminisce. I became a machine of disposal. The Tom Ford suits he'd worn to play the part of the successful mogul. Into the bag. The limited edition sneakers he'd obsessed over, which cost more than some people's monthly rent, into the bag. The designer watches he'd insisted were investments, but which I had ultimately financed, into the bag. I moved through the room with a clinical efficiency, stripping the shelves of his cologne, his silk ties, his arrogance. Each garment I shoved into the plastic was a vestige of the man I thought I knew. I felt a grim, tactile satisfaction in seeing his curated image reduced to the lumpy, crinkled shape of refuse. When I was finished, 6 black bags stood in the center of the room like an effigy of a failed decade. I dragged them one by one into the hallway. I lined them up against the mahogany-paneled wall outside my door. In the harsh fluorescent light of the corridor, the bags looked exactly like what they were: garbage waiting for collection. I went back inside, locked the door again, and sat on the sofa with a glass of water. I turned off the lights. I wanted to be a shadow when the reality of his upgrade finally met the pavement. 1:02 a.m. The vibration of my phone on the coffee table sounded like an insect hitting a window pane. "Julian. Hey, just got back to the building. My fob isn't working for the elevator. Can you buzz me up?" I watched the screen fade to black. I didn't move. I could almost feel the confusion radiating off him from 30 floors below. I imagined him standing in the lobby, Serafina probably clinging to his arm, both of them flushed with the high of their public betrayal, expecting to walk into a suite they didn't own. 1:15 a.m. The vibration was more insistent now. A flurry of texts followed by a call I silenced instantly. "Julian, Felicia? I know you're awake. The front desk says the access codes have been changed. What the hell is going on? Julian, pick up the phone. Don't be petty. I need to get some stuff for the morning. I'm not in the mood for games." The petty comment made me smile. A thin, serrated thing in the dark. To Julian, my self-preservation was games. My refusal to be his doormat was pettiness. He still believed he held the leash. He still believed that if he barked loud enough, I would come running to open the door and apologize for the inconvenience of his betrayal. 1:30 a.m. The elevator dings. I hear muffled voices in the hallway. I stand up and walk softly to the door, leaning my ear against the cool wood. "I'm telling you, she's just being dramatic." I hear Julian's voice, thin, strained, and stripped of its usual bravado. "She'll cool off. She just wants to make a point because of the post." "Julian, look." A younger, higher voice whispers. "Serafina." There is a note of disgust in her tone that makes my heart sing. Are those your bags?" There is a long, heavy silence in the hallway. I peer through the wide-angle lens of the peephole. Julian is standing over the trash bags, his face pale under the hallway lights. He looks diminished. He is reaching out a hand to touch the plastic, as if he can't believe that his $3,000 suits are currently touching the same floor where the neighbors put their recycling. Serafina is standing 3 feet away, her arms crossed over her champagne silk dress, her eyes darting around the hallway as if she's afraid someone might see her with a man who has been so unceremoniously evicted. Felicia! Julian bellows, pounding his fist against the door. The sound vibrates through the wood and into my marrow, but I don't flinch. Open this door. This is my apartment too. You can't just throw my things out like this. I lean in, my lips inches from the wood. I speak in a voice that is barely a whisper, yet I know it carries. It was never yours, Julian. It was just a house you visited. Now the visit is over. The pounding stops. I see him through the peephole, his jaw dropping, his eyes searching the door as if he can see me through the solid oak. He looks like a man who has suddenly realized the ground beneath him isn't a foundation, but a trapdoor. You're crazy, he hisses, but there is no conviction in it. He sounds like a child who has just been told no for the first time in his life. Take your bags, Julian. I say, my voice gaining a terrifying melodic clarity. The hallway has a strict no loitering policy for trash. If they're still here in 10 minutes, I'll call the building manager to have them incinerated. Along with your first-class reputation. I hear Serafina mutter something about this being too much drama, and not what he promised. She turns and heads toward the elevator without him. Julian stands there for a moment, torn between his ego and his belongings. Finally, with a cursed grunt of humiliation, he begins to grab the bags, his designer life rustling like cheap plastic as he drags it away. I walk back to the window and watch the street below. A few minutes later, I see them emerge. Julian is struggling with the heavy bags, trying to flag down a taxi while Serafina stands several paces away, looking at her phone, already distancing herself from the wreckage. They were a glow-up. They were the future. As the yellow cab pulled away, disappearing into the neon veins of the city, I felt the ice inside me begin to settle into something permanent. The apartment was mine again. The air felt cleaner. But the eviction was just the physical manifestation of the end. Tomorrow I would begin the financial autopsy. Tomorrow I would show Julian what happens when you try to steal from the person who keeps the books. I lay down in my bed, the center of it for once, and closed my eyes. For the first time in 6 months, I didn't listen for a key in the lock. I knew exactly where I was, and more importantly, I knew exactly where he wasn't. The sun rose over the Manhattan skyline in a palette of bruised purples and cold, unforgiving golds. I watched it from the floor-to-ceiling windows of the kitchen, the city waking up in a frantic hum of ambition and indifference. For the first time in a decade, the silence of the apartment didn't feel like a void waiting to be filled by Julian's booming laughter or his endless critiques. It felt like a clean slate, a sterile operating room. I went through the motions of my morning ritual with a surgical precision. The grinding of the coffee beans was a rhythmic, aggressive sound that mirrored the gears turning in my mind. The smell, rich, dark, and slightly bitter, was the only thing anchoring me to the physical world. I wasn't just making a drink, I was preparing for a siege. At 8:01 a.m., I sat at the marble island with my laptop open and my phone resting beside my cup. I pulled up the joint account statement on the screen. There it was, a gaping 6-figure hole in our history. Julian had moved the funds at 11:45 p.m. the night before, just as the birthday candles were being extinguished. He had been so sure of my passivity that he hadn't even bothered to stagger the transfers. He wanted the clean break, the instant windfall to fund his new life with Serafina. I took a sip of the coffee, letting the heat sear my tongue. Then, I dialed the bank's high-priority fraud line. Thank you for calling Premier Private Banking. This is Marcus speaking. How can I assist you this morning? Good morning, Marcus, I said. My voice was a masterpiece of controlled distress, measured, professional, yet carrying the faint, unmistakable tremor of a woman who had just discovered a violation. My name is Felicia Walker. I'm calling to report a series of unauthorized transfers from my joint savings account ending in 8802. I see the account here, Ms. Walker. I'm sorry to hear that. To better assist you, can you confirm if you recognize the destination account? It appears to be a personal account belonging to a Mr. Julian Carter. I recognize the name, I said, my grip tightening on the porcelain mug. He is my former partner. However, these transfers were made without my consent and in direct violation of our standing verbal and written agreements regarding these specific funds. More importantly, I have received written confirmation from Mr. Carter himself that these funds were taken maliciously. There was a brief, pregnant pause on the other end. The clicking of a keyboard was the only sound. You have written confirmation of the intent, ma'am? Marcus's tone shifted from standard customer service to the sharp, alert register of a fraud investigator. I do. At 12 a.m. today, Mr. Carter sent me a text message stating, and I quote, I transferred our money into my personal account. Felt fair since I was the one making most of it. He also referred to this as an upgrade to a new life. He admitted to the seizure of the assets as a preemptive strike during a personal dispute. I felt a dark, cold spark of satisfaction. In his rush to humiliate me, Julian had done the one thing a thief should never do. He had provided the electronic fingerprints and a signed confession before the body was even cold. His arrogance was his own prosecutor. Ms. Walker, please hold. I'm bringing our legal and compliance lead onto the call. If you can forward a screenshot of that message to the secure portal I'm about to send you, we can initiate an immediate administrative freeze on the recipient account pending a formal investigation. I'm sending it now, I said. I uploaded the screenshot. There was the photo of him and Serafina in the background of our chat, and right beneath it, his arrogant declaration of theft. Felt fair. Julian's definition of fairness was about to meet the banking industry's definition of grand larceny. While I waited on hold, I watched the clock on my stove. 8:45 a.m. 9 a.m. The mechanism of a bank freeze is a silent, invisible execution. It doesn't come with a bang or a flash of light. It's simply a digital wall that rises up, turning a fortune into a useless string of numbers. Julian would have no idea. He was likely at breakfast right now, perhaps at that boutique cafe Serafina loved, ordering avocado toast and mimosas, feeling like the king of the world. He would reach for his wallet, feeling the weight of his new wealth, entirely unaware that the vault had already been sealed. Ms. Walker. It was a new voice, older, grimmer. This is Sarah from compliance. We've reviewed the evidence. Given the clear admission of intent to seize shared assets without authorization, we have placed a 72-hour administrative freeze on Mr. Carter's personal account. During this time, all outgoing transactions, including ATM withdrawals and point-of-sale purchases, are suspended. And the funds he transferred? They are flagged as contested. He will not be able to touch a cent until he can prove a legal right to those specific amounts, which, given your documentation, will be a difficult climb. We will also be notifying the authorities of a potential fraud report. Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate your efficiency. I hung up the phone. 9:30 a.m. The empire was officially on ice. I leaned back, the steam from my coffee swirling in the morning light. I closed my eyes and allowed myself a moment to visualize the scene. I saw Julian, his chest puffed out, sliding his card across a mahogany table to pay for a celebratory breakfast. I saw the server's confused expression as the machine blinked declined. I saw Julian's dismissive laugh, the way he would pull out a second card, then a third, only to find that every single one of them, linked to his frozen empire, was a dead piece of plastic. I saw the look on Serafina's face as the first-class fantasy began to crack at the edges, the realization dawning on her that she was dating a man who couldn't even pay for a cup of coffee. Julian had thought he was taking the money and the power. He didn't realize that in my world, money is the power, and I was the one who controlled the flow. By transferring the funds so brazenly, he hadn't secured his future. He had created a paper trail that led directly to his own neck. He had turned a civil dispute into a criminal liability. The heartbreak was still there, a dull rhythmic throb beneath my ribs, but it was being smothered by the sheer, cold beauty of the architecture I was building. This was the foundation of his ruin. He had called me old. He had called me economy class. I took the final sip of my coffee, the bitterness now tasting like victory. Welcome to the freeze, Julian, I whispered to the empty, sun-drenched kitchen. I hope you brought a coat. The phone on the counter began to vibrate. I didn't even have to look to know who it was. The first wave of panic had officially made landfall. I let it ring until it went to voicemail, then I stood up, walked to my office, and began the next phase of the demolition. He thought the money was the prize. He was about to find out it was actually the anchor that was going to pull him under. The silence of my home office was clinical, punctuated only by the soft rhythmic hum of my laptop's cooling fan. I sat amidst a sea of spreadsheets and digital statements, the architect conducting a postmortem on a collapsed structure. My morning coffee had gone cold, a forgotten dreg of bitterness at the bottom of the cup, much like the remnants of my sympathy for Julian. The bank freeze was the foundation of his ruin, but Julian was a man built on facades. He wouldn't believe the walls were closing in until he felt the cold touch of the stone. My screen flickered. A new notification appeared in my inbox, a ghost from the life I was systematically dismantling. It was a confirmation email from the Azuria, an ultra-exclusive resort in the Maldives where the villas floated over turquoise water like scattered diamonds. Mr. Carter, your Royal Horizon suite is ready for your arrival. We look forward to welcoming you and your guest. I leaned back, a dry, mirthless laugh escaping my throat. The Royal Horizon. A victory lap. He had planned this weeks ago, while he was still kissing my forehead and telling me we should look at retirement properties in Tuscany. It wasn't just a getaway. It was a coronation for his new life. And he had used my Black Label credit card, the one he'd insisted on keeping in his digital wallet for emergencies, to secure the 5-figure deposit and the flight upgrades. Julian's definition of an emergency was apparently the need to parade his 20-something trophy in front of the world's elite on my dime. I looked at the card details on the screen. He hadn't even had the decency to use the money he'd stolen from our savings yet. He was still operating on the momentum of my credit, a parasite that hadn't realized the host had developed an immune response. I picked up the phone. My movements were slow, deliberate, almost ritualistic. The Azuria reservations. This is Maya speaking. How may I assist you? Good morning, Maya. My name is Felicia Walker. I'm calling regarding a reservation under the name Julian Carter. Confirmation number Alpha 972. Yes, Ms. Walker. How can I help you with this booking? We are so excited to host Mr. Carter and his guest tomorrow. I'm afraid there's been a security breach, I said. My voice was like silk stretched over a razor blade. The credit card used to secure that reservation, and the subsequent flight upgrades, was used without the primary cardholder's authorization. I am the primary cardholder. I'm calling to report the transactions as fraudulent and to cancel every aspect of the itinerary. Immediately, a beat of silence followed. I could practically hear the digital gears grinding on the other side of the world. I see. One moment, Ms. Walker. I'll need to speak with my manager. While I waited, I closed my eyes. I didn't need to be there to see it. My mind, sharpened by a decade of designing spaces meant to evoke specific emotions, began to construct the scene with terrifying, cinematic clarity. I imagined Julian arriving at the airport first. He'd be wearing that linen suit I bought him for our anniversary, the one that made him look like old money. Serafina would be beside him, a whirlwind of designer luggage and artificial scent, her eyes hidden behind oversized sunglasses, already practicing her vacation poses for her followers. They would stride toward the first-class check-in counter, Julian radiating the effortless confidence of a man who believes he has finally outrun his debts. I imagine the moment he hands over his passport and the card. The agent, a woman with a practiced, immovable smile, swipes it. A frown flickers across her face. She tries again. The machine emits a soft, discordant beep. Declined. Julian laughs, that booming, condescending laugh he uses to mask his insecurity. Check it again, darling. There's plenty of room on that one. But there wouldn't be. Because by the time he reached that counter, I wouldn't just have canceled the trip. I would have reported the card as stolen. I shifted my mental architecture to the resort. I saw them arriving at the private jetty, perhaps having managed to scrap together enough cash for a last-minute coach flight, still desperate to salvage the Royal Horizon dream. I saw Julian standing at the marble-topped reception desk of the Azuria, the scent of sea salt and expensive hibiscus in the air. He would be sweating now, the humid air of the Maldives beginning to wilt his linen suit. He would present the card for the incidental hold. A mere formality, he would tell Serafina. Clack. The sound of the card hitting the marble. The receptionist's eyes would meet his, not with the usual deference reserved for the wealthy, but with a cold, professional pity. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carter," she would say, her voice carrying across the hushed, opulent lobby where other guests, actual first-class people, would be watching. "This card has been flagged for fraudulent activity. And I see here that your reservation was cancelled by the primary account holder yesterday. We have no record of a Royal Horizon suite for you. In fact, we are fully booked." I imagined the silence that would follow. The way Julian's face would turn a mottled, ugly purple. The way Serafina would take a half-step back, her upgrade suddenly looking like a liability. I saw the eyes of the other guests, the silent, piercing judgment of the elite who can smell a fraud from a mile away. Julian's greatest fear was appearing small. And in that lobby, under the soaring bamboo ceilings and the weight of a dozen judgmental stares, he would be microscopic. "Ms. Walker." Maya's voice returned, snapping me back to my office. "We have processed the cancellation. The funds have been reversed to your account, and the security department has flagged the name Julian Carter. We apologize for the inconvenience." "Thank you, Maya. It was no inconvenience at all." I hung up. A visceral surge of adrenaline raced through me, followed by a terrifying sense of peace. Julian had spent months building a fantasy life on the bones of our relationship. He wanted to upgrade to a world of luxury and youth, using my labor as the currency. He wanted a victory lap? He was going to get a marathon of humiliation instead. He had forgotten that a first-class life requires more than just a stolen credit card and a younger companion. It requires a foundation of integrity, something he had traded away long ago. He was a man who lived for the launch, for the public declaration of his success. He had no idea how to handle the bounce. I looked at the clock. If my calculations were correct, he was likely at the airport now. The first domino had just been tapped. I picked up my cold coffee and took a sip. It still tasted like iron and ash, but the fire in my belly kept me warm. Julian had tried to steal my dignity by calling me economy. He was about to find out that when you lose the support of the woman who built your world, you don't just get downgraded. You get grounded. Forever. I opened a new tab on my browser. Phase 3 was calling. It was time to look into his professional overtime records. If Julian wanted to play in the big leagues of betrayal, I was going to ensure he followed the rules of the audit. "Enjoy the view from the terminal, Julian," I whispered. "It's the only horizon you'll be seeing for a long, long time." The afternoon sun was beginning to slant across my office, casting long skeletal shadows over the blueprints of a life I was no longer living. I sat in my ergonomic chair, the leather cool and firm against my back, watching the digital dust motes dance in the light. My phone, resting on the mahogany desk, felt like a dormant explosive. I had ignored 17 calls from Julian in the last 4 hours. I had listened to 3 voicemails that began with screaming and ended in pathetic, ragged sobbing. But when the phone vibrated at 3:14 p.m. with an unknown number, I knew instinctively it wasn't him. Julian didn't have the stomach for anonymity. He needed the weight of his name, even if that name was currently radioactive. I picked it up on the 3rd ring. I didn't say hello. I simply waited, letting the silence be the first thing she encountered. "Felicia." The voice was exactly as I had imagined. High-pitched, melodic, but currently frayed at the edges like cheap ribbon. It was the sound of a woman who had been promised a private jet and ended up on a delayed bus. "Speaking," I said. My voice was a sovereign entity, calm, resonant, and entirely untouchable. "This is Serafina," she said, her tone sharpening with a desperate kind of bravado. "Look, I don't know what kind of sick game you're playing, but you need to stop. Right now. Julian is. He's in a state. You froze his accounts? You canceled our trip? That is so beyond petty. It's illegal." I leaned back, a small dark smile touching my lips. I could almost smell the cheap perfume and the scent of airport terminal panic through the speaker. "Petty is a word used by people who don't understand the concept of consequences, Serafina," I said softly. "And as for illegal, I suggest you ask your king about the legalities of grand larceny and credit card fraud before you start quoting the law to me." "He said you were controlling," she spat, though I could hear the tremor in her breath. "He said you try to ruin him because you're bitter about being replaced. But this? leaving us stranded at the airport? He had to call his mother for a ride, Felicia. Do you have any idea how embarrassing that was? I closed my eyes, savoring the image. Julian Carter, the man of first-class ambition, standing at the curb of JFK with 6 black trash bags of his life, waiting for his mother's sensible sedan while his upgrade looked on in horror. I imagine it was excruciating, I replied. But let's be very clear about the architecture of this situation, Serafina. You aren't calling me out of a sense of justice. You're calling me because the man you thought was an upgrade has turned out to be a hollow shell. You're calling because the champagne has stopped flowing and the bill has finally arrived. He's a successful man, she yelled, her voice cracking. He's a partner. He's a ghost. I interrupted, my voice dropping an octave, becoming the cold, hard floor she was about to hit. Listen to me very carefully, because I'm only going to explain this once. The man you're currently crying in your cereal over didn't earn the life you saw on his Instagram. He didn't earn the watches, the suits, or the penthouse. I built that. I was the one who balanced the books while he played at being a mogul. I was the one who funded the startups that never started. I was the one whose credit score allowed him to walk into rooms he had no business being in. I paused, letting the weight of the revelation settle into the silence. Every dinner you've had with him for the last 6 months? Paid for by me. The silk dress you wore in that glow-up photo? Secured by my credit card. Even the very phone he used to text me that he was leaving me was part of a family plan I manage. You didn't upgrade to a better life, Serafina. You just inherited my ward. You took a man who has been living off the labor of a woman he deemed economy class because he was too lazy to build a life of his own. You're lying, she whispered, but the bravado was gone. It was the sound of a child realizing the monster in the closet is actually just an empty suit. Am I? Ask him to show you his personal bank balance right now. Not the joint one he tried to steal, which is currently a frozen legal liability. Ask to see his earnings. Ask him why his name isn't on the lease of the apartment. Ask him why he had to use my card for the Royal Horizon suite. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city that Julian thought he had conquered. You thought you were winning a prize, didn't you? You thought you were stepping into a pre-made world of luxury. But Julian doesn't build worlds. He just inhabits the ones women build for him until the rent is due. And Serafina? The rent is very much due. You wanted the man? You have him. You have the debt, the unemployment, the legal investigation, and the 6 bags of trash in his mother's basement. That is your first-class seat. The silence on the other end was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating thing. The sound of a young woman's vanity collapsing under the weight of reality. I could almost see her looking at Julian in that moment, really looking at him, and seeing the cracks in the veneer, the desperation in his eyes, the sheer pathetic smallness of the man who had promised her the stars on someone else's dime. He told me he was the one taking care of you, she said, her voice barely audible. Julian tells a lot of stories, I said, my tone almost gentle now. He's a master of the narrative, but I'm a master of the audit. And in my world the numbers never lie. He didn't leave me for someone better, Serafina. He left me because I was the only person who knew exactly how much he owed. He chose you because you were young enough to believe the lie and naive enough to be his next shield. I waited for a rebuttal, a scream, a defense. None came. Enjoy the upgrade, I said, and then I hung up. I set the phone back on the desk. I felt a strange sense of mourning. Not for Julian but for the girl on the other end of the line. She was a pawn in a game she didn't even know was being played. But my sympathy was a fleeting thing, a ghost in the machine. Julian had tried to use Serafina as a weapon to destroy my dignity. Instead, he had turned her into the first witness to his own fraud. The silence of the office returned, but it was no longer heavy. It was light. It was the sound of a space that had been cleared of clutter. I picked up my pen and returned to my work. The demolition was proceeding exactly according to the blueprints. Julian Carter had wanted a new life. He was about to find out that when you build a house on a foundation of lies, the only thing you truly own is the rubble when it falls. And as for Serafina, she had just learned the most expensive lesson of her life. When a man tells you he's an upgrade, check the receipts. Because more often than not, he's just a debt looking for a new place to hide. They say that in architecture, the most dangerous flaw isn't the one you can see. It's the one buried in the ledger. A building can look magnificent, all glass and soaring steel, while the math beneath it is slowly, quietly eating itself alive. Julian was that building. He was a master of the facade, a man who spent his entire career polishing his high-value man persona, while the structural integrity of his character was rotting from within. I sat in my home office, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in my glasses. The city outside was a chaotic grid of light, but inside these walls, I was a creature of absolute order. I had spent the last decade protecting Julian's reputation, smoothing over his eccentricities with clients, and ensuring his professional life remained as pristine as his laundered shirts. But Julian had forgotten that I wasn't just his partner. I was his silent auditor. The catalyst wasn't a grand gesture of revenge on my part. It was, quite ironically, Julian's own thirst for validation. His Instagram hard launch, the one where he posed with Serafina at the Nomad with the caption about upgrading, had gone viral within the incestuous circles of the city's top-tier firms. He wanted to be seen. He wanted the world to know he had a younger, shinier model. He got his wish. At 10 a.m. my phone chimed. It was a message from Marcus, a senior partner at Julian's firm, and someone who had always been a friend to me. Marcus, Felicia, I just saw Julian's post. I am so incredibly sorry. But I need to ask you something, and this stays between us. Is that girl Serafina from our junior analyst pool? I stared at the screen. My heart didn't skip a beat. It settled into a cold, heavy rhythm. Serafina. She wasn't just a friend of a friend, or a random girl from a club. She was a subordinate, a junior associate in his own department. Julian hadn't just cheated. He had committed corporate suicide. His firm, Vance and Sterling, had a non-negotiable zero-tolerance policy regarding fraternization between senior management and junior staff. It was the third rail of their corporate culture. And Julian, in his intoxicated rush to humiliate me, had grabbed it with both hands. I didn't have to do much. I simply replied with a single devastatingly neutral sentence. Felicia. I believe she is, Marcus. Julian mentioned she was a rising star. He was mentoring during those late-night sessions. That was the spark. The fire that followed was inevitable. By noon, the unintentional ripples of that post had reached HR. When a senior associate publicly brags about upgrading to a junior staff member while using words like first class, the legal department doesn't see a romance. They see a sexual harassment lawsuit waiting to happen. But the true collapse, the spectacular ground-level demolition, happened when they started looking at the receipts. Julian, in his infinite arrogance, believed he was smarter than the system. He believed that because he was a heavy hitter, the rules of the audit didn't apply to him. For months, he had been expensing our business dinners, the ones where he was supposedly closing deals while he was actually courting Serafina, to the firm's discretionary fund. I knew this because I had seen the credit card statements. I had seen the client meeting $400 at Le Coucou on a Tuesday night when I knew for a fact the client was in London. I had seen the travel research $1,200 for a weekend in the Hamptons when he told me he was at a conference. At 4:45 p.m. the final pillar fell. My phone rang. It was Julian. I answered, expecting the usual vitriol. Instead, I heard the sound of a man who had just watched his reflection shatter. Felicia, he whispered. His voice was hollow, stripped of the booming confidence that had been his armor for 10 years. They fired me. I leaned back in my chair, looking at the city skyline. Did they, Julian? On what grounds? They did a full audit, he stammered. I could hear the sound of city traffic in the background. He was on the street. He had likely been escorted out by security, his belongings in a box, his dignity in the gutter. They found the expenses. They found out about Serafina. Marcus wouldn't even look me in the eye. They're calling it moral turpitude and financial misconduct. They're clawing back my year-end bonus. Moral turpitude, I repeated, tasting the words. It has a certain architectural weight to it, don't you think? It means the foundation was never there to begin with. You did this, he hissed, the old venom returning for a fleeting second. You whispered in Marcus's ear. You knew what would happen if people saw that post. No, Julian. I said, my voice dropping to a terrifying melodic calm. You did this. You were the one who posted the glow-up for the world to see. You were the one who thought you could treat a multi-million-dollar firm like your personal piggy bank. You were the one who thought a 22-year-old subordinate was a prize you could flaunt without consequence. I didn't write your expense reports, Julian. I just stopped correcting them. I have nothing, he choked out. The bank accounts are frozen, the trip is cancelled, and now I'm blacklisted. Nobody in this city will touch me after a misconduct firing. I'm ruined. You're not ruined, Julian, I said, looking at the empty space where his designer watches used to sit on my desk. You're just finally seeing yourself without the filters. You wanted a new chapter. Remember? This is it. It's a tragedy, but at least it's honest. Felicia, please. Goodbye, Julian. I hung up. I felt a strange, shimmering sense of completion. Julian had spent his life trying to be the architect of success, but he had only ever been a squatter in a house I built. He had tried to upgrade his life by discarding the woman who held the blueprints, never realizing that without the blueprints, he didn't know how to keep the roof from caving in. He was now unemployed, disgraced, and blacklisted. In the high-stakes world of New York finance, he was a ghost. A cautionary tale. The man who traded a decade of loyalty for a week of Instagram likes and an HR nightmare. The economy-class ex-girlfriend was still sitting in the penthouse, still holding the lease, still managing the accounts, and the first-class king was currently standing on a sidewalk, clutching a cardboard box, realizing that the upgrade had cost him everything he ever pretended to be. I walked to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of sparkling water. The silence of the apartment was no longer lonely. It was pristine. It was the sound of a structure that had been cleared of its rot. Julian wanted a life without me. Now he had one. It was empty, cold, and entirely his own. The professional collapse was over. The personal audit was complete. And as I watched the sun set over the Hudson, I realized that the most beautiful thing about a ruin is the space it leaves for something new to grow. But first, I had one last meeting to attend. A meeting with a lawyer to ensure that the frozen funds returned to the woman who actually earned them. The morning air in the penthouse was sterile, smelling of lemon polish and the absence of a ghost. I was sitting at the dining table, the sun carving sharp geometric shapes across the white marble, when the peace was shattered not by a phone call, but by the heavy, authoritative thud of knuckles against oak. It wasn't Julian's frantic pounding. This was different. This was the rhythmic, measured beat of the state. I stood up, smoothing the front of my cream cashmere sweater. I felt an odd, detached curiosity. I already knew what this was. Julian, stripped of his job, his money, and his first-class fantasy, had reached for the only weapon he had left, the theater of victimhood. He was going to try to use the law to reclaim a territory he had already forfeited. I opened the door to find two officers in navy blue, their faces masks of professional boredom. Behind them, hovering like a specter of his former self, was Julian. He looked diminished. The transformation was startling. The king who had posted the glow-up photos 48 hours ago had been replaced by a man who looked like he'd been sleeping in his clothes. His hair was greasy, his eyes were bloodshot, and the arrogant tilt of his chin had been replaced by a desperate, twitchy energy. He was trying to project alpha authority, but he was vibrating with the frequency of a cornered animal. "Can I help you, officers?" I asked. My voice was a sheet of black ice, smooth, cold, and utterly solid. "Miss Walker?" the taller officer asked, glancing at his notepad. "We received a report of stolen property. Mr. Carter here claims you are unlawfully withholding his belongings and refusing him entry to his primary residence." Julian stepped forward, his voice cracking. "She changed the locks, officer. All my stuff. My designer watches, my electronics, my suits. She's holding them hostage. She's trying to ruin me." I didn't look at him. I kept my gaze fixed on the officer, a small, weary smile touching my lips, the smile of a rational woman dealing with a tragic, irrational child. "I see," I said softly. "Officer, would you mind stepping inside for a moment? I have the documentation you'll need." "You can't go in there," Julian yelled, his face turning a mottled, ugly red. "That's my home. I have a right to be in there." "Actually," I said, turning my head just enough to catch his eye, "you don't." I led the officers to the foyer table where a neat leather folder was already waiting. I had been an architect for too long to leave anything to chance. I built my defenses before the storm hit. I handed the lead officer the lease agreement. As you can see, I said, my voice resonating with a calm, clinical authority, I am the sole signatory on the lease for this apartment. Mr. Carter has never been a legal tenant. He was a guest, a long-term guest certainly, but he has no legal claim to this residence. I terminated his guest status 2 nights ago following a series of financial irregularities. The officer scanned the document, his eyebrows rising. He looked at Julian, then back at the paper. This is a private lease, Mr. Carter. Your name isn't here. I paid for things. Julian screamed. He was pacing the hallway now, his hands flying through the air. I lived there for years. You can't just kick me out. And as for the stolen property, I continued, ignoring the outburst. I gestured toward the hallway behind the officers, where the 6 black trash bags still sat, neatly lined up like a row of body bags. Mr. Carter's belongings have been packed and ready for him since the moment he was asked to leave. I haven't touched a single item. I simply moved the trash to the curb, so to speak. The second officer walked over to the bags, nudging one with his boot. The sound of rustling plastic, the sound of Julian's first-class suits being treated like refuse, echoed through the quiet corridor. Everything he owns is right there, I said. I've even included the chargers for his electronics. I want nothing of his in my home, including him. Julian's alpha mask didn't just slip, it disintegrated. He realized, in the face of my glacial calm and the officer's indifference, that his power was a hallucination. He had spent 10 years believing he was the sun, and now he was discovering he was just a shadow that had been cast by my light. You're a cold-hearted bitch, Felicia, he roared, lunging toward the doorway. The taller officer moved with a practiced, casual speed, putting a firm hand on Julian's chest and pushing him back. Take it easy, sir, the officer warned, his voice dropping into a dangerous register. This is a civil matter. The lady has shown us the lease. She has provided your property. There is no theft here. There is only an ex-boyfriend who needs to move on. She froze my money. Julian's voice had risen to a high-pitched, hysterical shriek. He was no longer a man. He was a tantrum in a wrinkled shirt. She's the one who stole. Ask her about the bank accounts. Sir, the officer said, his patience clearly evaporated. If there's a dispute over bank accounts, you take that to a lawyer. We are here for a welfare check and a property dispute. The property is in those bags. The lease is hers. You need to take your things and leave the premises, or we will be forced to cite you for trespassing and disorderly conduct. The silence that followed was heavy with Julian's humiliation. He stood there, looking at the 2 officers, then at the trash bags, then finally at me. For a split second, I saw the man I had once loved. I saw the fear in his eyes, the raw, naked terror of a man who has realized he has no floor beneath him. He had tried to upgrade to a life of luxury and youth, and instead, he was being told to take his trash bags and get out by a man in a uniform who didn't even know his name. I hate you, he whispered, the words trembling with a pathetic, childish spite. I know, Julian, I replied, my voice steady and devoid of malice. That's the most honest thing you've said in months. Now please. You're blocking the hallway. The officers watched as Julian, his shoulders slumped, began to drag the bags toward the elevator. The sound was agonizing. The plastic screeching against the floor, the heavy thuds of his designer shoes hitting the carpet. He looked like a refugee from a war he had started himself. The taller officer turned back to me, tipping his cap slightly. Sorry for the disturbance, ma'am. We'll make sure he clears out of the lobby. Thank you, officer. I appreciate your time. I closed the door. I leaned my back against the wood, listening. I heard the elevator ding. I heard the muffled sound of Julian shouting one last, incoherent profanity into the void of the hallway before the doors hissed shut. He was gone. The alpha was a memory. The king was a ghost. All that was left was a desperate man shouting at a closed door, realizing too late that the woman he tried to destroy was the only thing that had been keeping him whole. I walked back to the dining table and picked up my pen. My hand was perfectly still. The house was quiet again. But it wasn't the silence of a tomb. It was the silence of a sanctuary. I looked at the lease at my name and only my name at the bottom of the page. Julian had wanted to leave me on my birthday, thinking he was taking the world with him. He didn't realize that by walking out that door, he had finally let the light back in. I began to draft the final instructions for my lawyer. The tea room was an exercise in faded elegance. All floral wallpaper, heavy lace doilies, and the clinking of silver spoons against porcelain that sounded like distant, tiny bells. It was the kind of place that smelled of bergamot and old secrets, a sanctuary for women who preferred their tragedies served with a side of scones. I sat by the window, watching the rain smear the streets of the Upper West Side into a watercolor of gray and charcoal. I was 39, and for the first time in a decade, I wasn't checking my watch to see if I was late for Julian's dinner or early for his demands. Evelyn arrived 10 minutes late. She looked as though the last week had aged her 5 years. The sharp, impeccably coiffed woman I had known, the one who prided herself on her family's impeccable standing, seemed to have wilted. Her coat was buttoned wrong, and there was a frantic, hollow look in her eyes that made my chest tighten with a brief, vestigial spark of pity. She didn't sit. She collapsed into the chair opposite me. "Felicia," she began, her voice trembling with a cocktail of grief and accusations. "What have you done? My son is a ghost of himself. He's sleeping in his old childhood bedroom. He hasn't eaten in days. He's lost his job, his reputation, his home. Everything. How could you be so cruel? After 10 years to tear his life down in a single week." I looked at her, my expression as unreadable as a blank blueprint. I didn't feel the urge to defend myself. I didn't feel the heat of anger rising in my throat. I felt only the profound, heavy stillness of a woman who had finished an audit and found the balance at zero. "I didn't tear his life down, Evelyn," I said, my voice low and steady, cutting through the porcelain clatter of the room. "I simply stopped holding the walls up. There is a significant difference between destruction and the cessation of support." "He said you trapped him," Evelyn hissed, leaning across the table, her pearls clicking against the wood. "He said you manipulated the bank, that you lied to his firm, that you threw his belongings into the street like he was a common criminal. He's my son, Felicia. He's a good man who made a mistake, and you've decided to play God with his future." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my Darjeeling. The bitterness was grounding. "Let's talk about that mistake, Evelyn," I said, setting the cup down with a soft clink. "Because I think you've been reading a very different version of the script." I reached into my bag and pulled out a small stack of papers, the physical manifestations of Julian's new chapter. I laid them on the lace tablecloth like tarot cards predicting a fall. "This," I said, pointing to the first page, "is the transcript of the text your son sent me on my 39th birthday. While I was blowing out my candles, he was telling me he had found an upgrade. He told me he had emptied our joint savings, money I earned, money I saved, because he felt it was fair. He didn't just leave me, Evelyn. He tried to bankrupt me as a birthday gift." Evelyn's eyes darted to the paper. She didn't pick it up. She didn't want the ink to stain her hands. "And this," I continued, sliding the next sheet forward, "is the internal audit from Vance and Sterling. Julian wasn't fired because of me. He was fired because he was funneling firm money into his dates with a 22-year-old junior associate. He was expensing his betrayals to his partners. He violated the morality clause of his contract and committed financial misconduct. He wasn't trapped. He was caught." The silence that followed was suffocating. Evelyn stared at the documents, her breathing becoming shallow and ragged. The maternal shield, that invisible, fiercely guarded barrier she had used to protect her son from the consequences of his own arrogance since he was a boy, was beginning to crack. He told me it was a business dispute," she whispered, her voice losing its edge. "He said you were being controlling about the money. Is it controlling to want your own salary to stay in your own account?" I asked, my voice devoid of sarcasm, purely clinical. "Is it controlling to expect a partner of 10 years not to use your credit card to book a luxury getaway for his mistress? Julian didn't make a mistake, Evelyn. A mistake is forgetting an anniversary or losing a set of keys. Julian acted with predatory intent. He calculated my worth, decided I was a depreciating asset, and tried to liquidate me before I noticed the market had changed. I watched her face. Truly watched it. I saw the moment the denial died. It wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow, agonizing realization that the man she had raised, the alpha, the success story, the golden boy, was, in reality, a parasite who had finally run out of hosts. She saw the predator beneath the silk tie. She looked at me, and for the first time I saw her see me. Not as an accessory to her son's life, not as the organized one who handled the boring details, but as a woman who had been systematically hunted by the person she loved most. I didn't know, she stammered, her hand shaking as she reached for her tea. He was always so confident. We thought he was doing so well. We were so proud of him. You were proud of the facade I helped him maintain, I said, and the words felt like a final brick being laid. I spent 10 years polishing his image. I edited his speeches, I managed his moods, I covered his debts, and I made sure he looked like the man you wanted him to be. I was the architect of his reputation. And when he decided he no longer needed the architect, he discovered that he didn't actually know how to keep the roof from caving in. Evelyn let out a jagged, broken sob. She looked away out toward the rain. What is he going to do, Felicia? He has nothing. No one will hire him. He has no money. He's 38 years old and he's back in his teenage bedroom. I felt a strange sensation then. It was a lightness, a sudden evaporation of a weight I hadn't even realized I was still carrying. For a week I had been the architect of ruin, the one managing the fallout, the one ensuring the justice was served. But as I looked at Julian's broken mother, I realized that I was finished. I was no longer responsible for his failure. I was no longer the custodian of his character. If he was a ghost, he was a ghost of his own making. If he was a predator, he was a predator who had finally found a cage. That is no longer my concern, Evelyn, I said, standing up. I smoothed my coat, the fabric feeling expensive and real against my skin. Julian is 38. It's time he learned that the world doesn't provide a first-class seat for free. Sometimes you have to actually build the plane. I reached into my bag one last time and pulled out a $20 bill, laying it on the table. For the tea. Felicia, she called out as I turned to leave. Do you think there's any hope for him? To be the man he used to be? I paused at the door, the scent of bergamot fading, replaced by the crisp, ozonic smell of the rain outside. I looked back at her one last time. He never was that man, Evelyn. He was just a hollow space that I filled with my own effort. Now that I'm gone, he's just empty. He doesn't need hope. He needs an audit of his soul. And that's a job he has to do alone. I walked out into the gray afternoon. The rain hit my face, cool and cleansing. As I stepped onto the sidewalk, I felt a profound sense of closure. The mother's lament was over. The family legacy was shattered. And as I hailed a taxi, I realized I wasn't thinking about Julian's childhood bedroom or his mother's tears. I was thinking about my 40th birthday. I was thinking about the buildings I would design, the life I would inhabit, and the fact that from now on, I would never again carry the weight of a man who didn't know how to stand on his own 2 feet. I was free. Truly, structurally, finally free. Time is the most honest architect I have ever known. It strips away the decorative lies of the present and reveals the structural integrity, or the rot, of what lies beneath. A year has passed since the birthday candles were blown out, and my world was firebombed by a text message. I am 40 now. In the industry, they say 40 is when an architect truly finds their voice, and as I stand in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in my new studio, I see a woman who has finally stopped designing for others and started building for herself. My firm, Walker & Associates, didn't just survive the year. It thrived. When I removed the financial and emotional leech that was Julian Carter, my energy shifted. I stopped pouring my brilliance into a hollow vessel and started pouring it into steel, glass, and stone. I am no longer the organized one behind a man. I am the lead. I am the name on the door. I am the foundation. Tonight, I am attending Chloe's wedding at a sprawling estate in the Hudson Valley. The air is thick with the scent of late summer jasmine and expensive champagne. The sun is dipping below the rolling hills, casting a honeyed, golden light over the guests. A golden hour that feels like a physical manifestation of my own rebirth. I am wearing a gown of liquid gold silk that clings to my frame with a confidence I didn't possess at 39. My hair is swept back, exposing the sharp, clean lines of my jaw. I feel grounded. I feel ethereal. I feel for the first time in my life entirely uncaged. You look like a goddess, Fee, Chloe whispers, squeezing my hand as she floats by in her white lace. And more importantly, you look happy. I am Chloe, I say, and I mean it. I finally like the view. As the reception begins, I move through the crowd with a practiced grace. I am laughing at a joke made by a prominent developer when I feel that atavistic prickle at the back of my neck. The sensation of being watched by a ghost. I turn my head, my gaze scanning the periphery of the ballroom, away from the warmth of the dance floor. And there, tucked into a shadowed corner near the service bar, I see him. Julian. The shock isn't that he's there. We still share mutual friends, though most have long since picked a side. The shock is the sheer visceral scale of his decline. If time has been a sculptor for me, it has been a wrecking ball for him. He looks a decade older than 39. His face is sallow, the skin beneath his eyes dark and heavy with a weariness that sleep won't fix. He is wearing a suit that makes my chest tighten with a brief, clinical pity. It's polyester, ill-fitting and shiny in the wrong places, the kind of garment a man buys when he's trying to simulate a status he can no longer afford. He is nursing a single, lukewarm beer, his hand trembling slightly as he leans against a pillar. He looks like a man who has spent the last year realizing that his first-class ticket was a forgery. I see the moment he spots me. His posture straightens for a fleeting second, a ghost of the old Julian trying to inhabit the ruins of the new one. He sets his beer down and begins to walk toward me. I don't move. I don't flee. I simply wait, my champagne flute held steady in my hand, as he navigates the crowd like a man walking through a minefield. Felicia, he says. His voice is different, thinner, raspier, stripped of the booming resonance that used to fill my home. Julian, I reply. My tone is neutral, the linguistic equivalent of a clean white room. He stands before me, and the smell of him is a revelation. Stale cigarettes and cheap cologne. He looks at my dress, at the diamond studs in my ears, at the sheer radiant power of my presence. I see the regret in his eyes. It's not the poetic, noble regret of a man who realized he lost a great love. It's the base, desperate regret of a man who realized he threw away his only meal ticket. You look incredible, he stammers. I heard about the firm. Everyone is talking about the new Amsterdam project. You really did it. I did, I say. I've wanted to call, he says, stepping closer, trying to lower his voice into that intimate register he used to use to manipulate me. I've spent a lot of time thinking about everything. About the way it ended. About the birthday. About Serafina. He pauses, waiting for me to ask, waiting for me to show a flicker of curiosity or hurt. I give him nothing. She's gone, by the way, he continues, a bitter edge creeping into his voice. She left the second things got difficult. She wasn't you, Felicia. I see that now. I made a catastrophic mistake. I was arrogant and I was stupid, and I let the best thing in my life go because I was chasing a shadow. He reaches out, his hand hovering near my arm, but he stops when he sees the look in my eyes. It isn't anger. It isn't even coldness. It is something far more devastating to a man of his ego. I'm sorry, he whispers, his voice cracking. I'm so sorry. I know I don't deserve it, but I needed you to know that I regret every second of what I did to you. I'm living in a nightmare, Felicia. I'm starting over from nothing, and every day is just a reminder of what I threw away. I hope you can find it in your heart to be happy that I've learned my lesson. He looks at me, his eyes searching mine for a sign of triumph, a spark of I told you so, or even a flare of hatred. He wants my emotion. He needs to know that he still has the power to make me feel something, even if that something is spite. He needs to be a protagonist in my story, even if he's the villain. I take a slow, rhythmic breath, the scent of the jasmine around us filling my senses. I look at the man who tried to destroy my dignity on my 39th birthday, and I realize with a sudden crystalline clarity that the audit is finally over. The debt is settled. Julian, I say, my voice as light and effortless as the silk of my gown. I think you're misunderstanding something. He tilts his head, a flicker of hope in his eyes. You think I've spent this year being happy about your downfall. I continue. You think I've been watching your life from the sidelines, savoring your failures as some kind of revenge. You think my happiness is somehow tethered to your misery. I take a small sip of my champagne, then look him directly in his bloodshot eyes. But the truth is far simpler, Julian. I don't think about you enough to be happy or unhappy about your life. To me, you aren't a tragedy or a triumph. You're just a corrected error in a draft I've already moved past. The color drains from his face. It's the ultimate kill. Not a scream, not a slap, not a lawsuit, but the revelation that he has become insignificant. I have denied him the only thing he has left, a place in my mind. Felicia, please. Enjoy the wedding, Julian, I say, already turning away. I hear the cake is excellent. I walk away from him, my gold heels clicking a steady rhythmic beat on the marble floor. I don't look back. I don't need to see the expression on his face or the way he sinks back into the shadows of the service bar. He is a ghost, and I am a woman who only designs for the living. I find my way back to the terrace where a man is waiting for me. He is a fellow architect, mature, brilliant, and someone who looks at me not as a trophy or a tool, but as an equal. He hands me a fresh glass of champagne and smiles, a real grounded smile that reaches his eyes. Ready to go? He asks. The car is out front. Yes, I say, sliding my hand into his. I'm ready. As we drive away from the estate, the Hudson Valley blurring into a streak of gold and shadow behind us, I lean my head back against the leather seat. The golden rebirth is complete. I didn't just survive the betrayal. I used the debris to build a skyscraper. The birthday girl who cried over a text message is gone. The woman who stands in her place is the architect of her own destiny. And as the city lights appear on the horizon, bright, sharp, and full of infinite possibility, I realize that the best way to win a war is to simply stop being a soldier. I am no longer in the business of ruin. I am in the business of light. Thank you so much for spending your valuable time with me today. Sharing a story this personal isn't easy, but I do it with the humble hope that it reminds you of your own worth. I truly believe that we all have the strength to turn our ruins into a masterpiece. I would be honored to hear your thoughts or your own stories of strength in the comments below. Your voice matters more than you know. If Felicia's journey touched your heart today, please consider subscribing to Queen's Revenge. Let's continue this journey of transformation and justice together.